Today we're in front of the rye variety trial at the University of Minnesota here in Crookston. This trial has been going on now for the 5th season in a row. The impetus 5 years ago was rather quite simple in that there's more and more interest in rye as a cover crop, and as a consequence you have to produce seed. And so one of the major retailers in cover crop seed asked me which one I thought was the best yielder for grain, and I didn't have an answer. And so we resurrected within the University of Minnesota the rye variety testing program, and we scrounged up a whole number of older varieties, and rye is a cross-pollinating species, so these were all open pollinated varieties. The oldest one at the time in the trials was Renza Bruzi, which is a 1956 release, I believe, out of the University of Florida and University of Georgia. Other one, Aristook from the USDA and Cornell. Spooner, Musketeer, which is a Canadian line. So all this was old germplasm. I think the youngest one at the time was already 20, 30 years old and had been around for a long time in production. At the same time, I said, well, that's in a way old hat. There's only two active breeding programs in the US. One is really focused on forages, which is at the Noble Foundation in Oklahoma, which we had a number of varieties in here as well. Albon being the current one in here. And there's one very small active breeding program at North Dakota State and at Carrington Research Station, and that one was just starting to release, was thinking about releasing the next one, which is a kind of a dual purpose cover crop forage species variety. So we started out with 20 varieties, and of those 20s I included 5 hybrids. In Europe, for about 20 years now, 25 years, there's 3-4 companies that have developed hybrid rye. In a way, because rye is a cross-pollinating species, it's much easier to create hybrid ryes. They developed a genetic male sterility system that allows them to produce hybrid seed rather cost-effectively. And so the question then became for me, which is what the more interesting portion was of resurrecting the trials, do these hybrids fit here? And we very quickly found out that the hybrids indeed are winter hardy enough and are actually excellently, greatly adapted to here with very high yield potential. Now the hybrids have some other advantages, and the best way I can explain that is by actually looking at these 3 varieties here. So this is ND Dillon, which is a new release out of North Dakota. It's, especially in the south, will get much, much taller. You can see it leaning already. You then look at one of KWS's hybrids, in this case it's Tayo, which is not that much shorter, but has much better straw strength. The difference in height gets larger if you go further south, where the hybrids are substantially shorter than the tallest open pollinated varieties. And I've seen, for instance, Spooner get above my head. And then finally, an older variety out of Canada, Musketeer, which, as you can see, has leaned over pretty substantially already. Maturity-wise, the hybrids are right in line with most of the open pollinated varieties that are adapted to here. Rye has a very strong daylight sensitivity response, and so we see, maturity not varying all that much. The earliest one is Albon by about 2 weeks, which is a southern U.S. variety developed in Oklahoma. So we've learned in the meantime that the hybrids are very competitive and out-yield the best open pollinated varieties, which is probably still Ryman, Danko, which is an old Polish variety, and Hazlet, which comes out of Canada. by about 30 to 40%. So we have a fair amount of hybrid vigor. That makes it that under very good conditions, hybrids probably can yield as much as 120 bushels in commercial fields. We've done higher yields in test plots, but that's a test plot, it's not fields. We know that they're winter hardy enough, that have excellent straw strength and overall good disease resistance. There's not as much diseases in rye as there is in, for instance, wheat or barley or oats. I haven't seen much leaf rust. I haven't seen a lot of septoria species in it. It is, however, still a small grain, and so we do have to worry about Fusarium head blight. And the work on seeing which fungicides and the timing of those fungicides work best is underway, including a project at the University of Kentucky, where a colleague of mine is also working with hybrid rye. The other thing that of course is always an issue with rye is because it's a cross-pollinator, there's a greater problem with ergot still. So this is a close-up of a ergot body. Ergot is caused by a fungus called Claviceps purpurae, and this fungus survives in the soil in these, eventually what this is called a sclerotia that will drop to the soil, and after a period of cold, aka the winter, and a wetter spring, these sclerotia will germinate, produce tiny little mushrooms, and those mushrooms then will release spores that will infect the crop if the conditions are favorable. And it infects the flowers. And the flowers then eventually get replaced by a new sclerotia that will drop to the soil again. The conditions that favor this development and those initial infections basically happen when there is sterility. Because if those florets open up, they're more prone for the spores to land in them. And the sterility occurs if they don't get pollinated, or if through heat, etc., you have genetic sterility where the plants just can't find pollen. Fortunately, technology has advanced so far that color sorters make separating ergot out of rye much, much easier. Nonetheless, it's still a food and feed issue, safety issue. And that's where I think the adoption of rye across the landscape is probably the greatest impediment, is that rye has this, in a way, reputation of being bad as a feedstuff simply because of ergot. And we have to manage ergot. Now, one of the things that we've noticed in our ratings is that the hybrids, because they're more uniform, they tend to pollinate all at the same time and thus set seed. And if you have very good seed set, you have a lot less risk of ergot. So there is an advantage simply by being a hybrid. Because they're a little bit more uniform, we see less ergot overall. Now, to get beyond the cover crop, like I said, you have to have a feed market. And you have to have a food market. And I brought some examples of, if you go to Northwest Europe, including the Netherlands or any of the Scandinavian countries, of what rye is used for. One of the funny things is, because rye doesn't contain gluten, this is the type of bread that you find in the northern part of the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Scandinavia. It's basically unleavened bread because there is no gluten to trap CO2 when you bake. It is basically a brick. Likewise, if you want to go a little bit lighter, you have the Vasa knäckebröd. Everybody knows the Swedish cook from the Muppets with knäckebröd. And of course, there's this use, but you can't get enough acres across the landscape because you don't need much before you have this bottle filled when it comes to rye whiskey. There is actually a resurgence in rye whiskey. In the founding days of the Union, most whiskey was actually made with rye. And a side project that came out of this whole variety trial is to actually put all these different varieties, the Musketeer, the Dillon, the Elbon, some of the hybrids, and put them over a still. And one of the things we've discovered, indeed, that individual varieties do impart different flavors to what they call white whiskey, or what some people would call moonshine. The worst one I tasted had the notes of geraniums. There's no other way to put it. A lot of them were like really cheap tequila, and some of them actually weren't all that bad. Now, that in of itself, they have a name for it in the distilling industry, but it is those volatiles that actually, combined with the wood sugars, when it goes into a cask, gives the final aroma to whatever the rye whiskey is. And supposedly, rye whiskeys have this spicy undertone.